Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Now, I don't know if I just have like the worst release schedule or the best release schedule maybe, but it always feels like Wizards of the Coast releases big drops on like Tuesdays usually, or sometimes Wednesday, but either like right before I have a video due or the day that I release a video, things like that, because they just released the horror themed subclasses. There's like 2 new subclasses and then revisions of a bunch of older subclasses. There's one that's missing that I saw that I'm a little surprised that's missing, but I don't have time to cover that before putting out a video for today, so I guess that'll have to come for this weekend. I might space those out a little bit more depending on what all the changes look like. But today we're going to look at Armor of Agathys. This is following the release of the Sage Advice Compendium that answers a bunch of frequently asked questions about how certain things work. But we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit, look at what it does now and how that works, and maybe kind of what class or subclass features exist that can maybe get more out of the Armor of Agathys spell in 2024 as compared to 2014. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. So we had the confirmation in the Sage Advice Compendium. So the question is asking, can you extend the duration of Armor of Agathys by gaining more temporary hit points? They answer, the spell requires you to have temporary hit points. They don't need to be from that spell. So I believe that the question itself is a little misworded and that the answer is answering a different question. The question should kind of be, can you prevent the Armor of Agathys spell from ending early by gaining additional temporary hit points? Which the answer would still apply. The answer is still yes to that question. The question as it's asked here kind of makes it sound like, can you extend the actual duration of the spell, the 1 hour duration of Armor of Agathys, by gaining more temporary hit points? And the answer to that question would be no. So the effect of Armor of Agathys ends after 1 hour, but you can still gain more additional hit points during that duration. And as long as you don't drop to 0 temporary hit points during that duration, you can continue the effect and keep doing that extra damage from Armor of Agathys while you have any sort of temporary hit points. So this is also to say that if you have temporary hit points that have a longer duration than Armor of Agathys, which many of them do because most temporary hit points will just last until the end of your next short rest, I believe. So once the Armor of Agathys duration ends after 1 hour, the effect of Armor of Agathys will end, but those temporary hit points that you gain from other sources that don't have a duration of 1 hour, you will still keep those. You'll just no longer do the cold damage when you're hit with an attack. So let's really quick just kind of break down Armor of Agathys, the spell itself. So we see that it is a bonus action to cast now in 2024, whereas it was an action previously in 2014. So it's a little easier to cast, although we'll see later that that kind of makes things a little awkward for some classes that can use it better now. It is an abjuration spell, which will matter for some purposes. It lasts 1 hour. It deals cold damage. I don't know that there's anything we can do with cold damage off the top of my head. I didn't find anything personally. Obviously if creatures are vulnerable to cold damage, but we can't really plan around that. And another thing that's actually pretty important is that the damage triggers on hit with a melee attack, and a hit means that an attack roll beats your armor class. Being dealt damage by that attack is irrelevant. As long as you are hit, that cold damage will be reflected back at the attacker. And then lastly, it upcasts for 5 additional temporary hit points and 5 additional cold damage per spell level above 1. So all in all, pretty similar to the way that it was in 2014. It's just easier to cast, and then you can kind of make it last longer within its given duration by gaining temporary hit points from other things. Those are the 2 main changes in the 2024 rules. So if we're looking at maximizing Armor of Agathys, we're going to be looking at a few things. So I think first things first, being able to keep Armor of Agathys going by layering additional temporary hit points means that we can get more out of lower level casts of Armor of Agathys. So previously in 2014, when we couldn't layer other temporary hit points to get more out of it, you really just wanted to upcast Armor of Agathys as much as you could to get the biggest pool of temporary hit points, and this would also just greatly increase the damage that gets reflected back. However, many spellcasters have also just much better spells that they could be casting at those higher levels. So maybe they don't want to be casting Armor of Agathys all the time. But now that we can layer other temporary hit points, we can even just cast a first level Armor of Agathys on us, and then use a different feature that we have to layer a bigger pool of temporary hit points on top of us. That way, any melee attack that we take is just going to reflect 5 damage back. And even if that only happens once per round, that's an extra, 5 DPR. We're not going to be doing any sort of DPR calculations in this video. I think it's not important for a spell like Armor of Agathys, but I'm just saying that if we were doing any sort of DPR calculations like on a martial build, an increase of 5 DPR would be significant. So even if we're just using a first level Armor of Agathys and then putting a bunch of temporary hit points on top of it in a different way, I think that's worth doing. And on that note, I think ideally our extra temporary hit points probably shouldn't be coming from other other spells, unless that spell is giving us a significant amount of temporary hit points, and it's probably having some other effects that we would want to be casting that spell anyway, and we aren't just doing it to get more out of Armor of Agathys. It is doing something else that we want to be doing anyway. So this is just going to help us reduce the amount of spell slots that we're expending in order to make the most out of Armor of Agathys. And obviously we're kind of building around it in a way, but it should feel a little bit more incidental that these things are working together. And continuing on that, if it is a one-time source of temporary HP where it's like it happens once or like once per long rest or something like that, it should be a pretty noticeable amount of temporary hit points. Whereas if it's a recurring source of temporary hit points, where if it happens like once per round, it should be enough to hopefully at least last us until the next round where we can get more temporary hit points again. And we'll see examples of that later as well. You know, resistances can double the effectiveness of temporary hit points, and by extension, you know, doubling the effectiveness of Armor of Agathys in that way, assuming that you're getting constantly hit by melee attacks. I'm not going to go deep dive into what all the different ways you can get resistance are. You know, if you're building a character, you can try to build those in. Its immunity is actually even better, of course, because immunity doesn't stop you from being hit. It just stops you from being damaged, and Armor of Agathys only triggers on hit. You're not going to be losing any temporary hit points, but you're still going to be reflecting all of that damage back. And of course, if we want to get the most damage out of Armor of Agathys while it's up, we ideally want to be in a position where we know we are going to be struck by melee attacks, or we can intentionally make ourselves a more appetizing target for melee attacks. There's a whole, I don't know if it's worth making a video about, but I have this whole thing in my head lately within like the last few months or so, kind of reflecting back on the previous campaign that we kind of recently ended, where it is worth it, even if you're a ranged character, to make yourself an appetizing target for attacks sometimes, you know, just so that your melee allies aren't getting just swatted every combat. But that's a whole nother thing. And because Armor of Agathys is on hit only, it does kind of early on have an inverse relationship with armor class, because we want to be hit. I mean, technically we don't want to be hit, but if we're looking at how to make Armor of Agathys more effective, technically we would want to be hit more often. And early on, that's kind of okay. I don't think there's any reason to intentionally lower your AC for any reason. But, you know, definitely in those early levels, you're probably not taking enough damage if you have a bigger temporary health pool to lose those temporary hit points before maybe you could re-up them the next turn. But definitely by like early, mid, or even just mid to late game, if an enemy focus fires on you, they're probably going to be able to drop your temporary hit points, except for maybe the most extreme cases where we're able to add just a ton of temporary hit points onto ourselves. So maybe not quite as much early on, but definitely as you level up and start fighting, you know, stronger and stronger enemies, that armor class, again, it is sort of antithetical to Armor of Agathys, but it is going to help make those things last longer by not allowing an enemy to make so many attacks against you in a single turn that they drop all of your temporary hit points before you get a chance to apply more to yourself. So with all that said, let's go ahead and jump into how we can access Armor of Agathys, because there are a few different ways. Some are more concrete and some would require a little bit more DM fiat. The first easiest way, of course, would be to take a level in Warlock, because it is a Warlock specific spell. The one downside to this is if you are multi-classing into another class, like taking one level of Warlock and then 19 levels in Wizard, not only does it have like the multi-classing requirements where you need to have at least a 13 in your Charisma, and if you're not also a Charisma caster like a Sorcerer, that might stretch you a little thin in some places. But there's also the fact that it's just going to set your primary spell casting back by one level. So when your other full casters are getting their, you know, their fourth level spells, you're still going to be on third level spells for at least one level more than you would be otherwise. The other sort of legitimate way would be through Inspelled Armor or an Inspelled Staff. Inspelled Armor has access to abjuration spells. Then the Inspelled Staves can have a spell from any school of magic. The Inspelled Weapons cannot. They do not have access to abjuration spells. But depending on the rarity of that Inspelled Armor or weapon, you could get any casting level of Armor of Agathys, so you could potentially get a higher level casting of it. And that would be free like 1d6 times per long rest, which is pretty much as you need. So if you're ever in a situation where you get to pick your own magic items, like for a one-shot or something like that, you could pick this up and kind of try this strategy out. Or if you're able to craft magic items, you could do this as well. The next way would be to play a Mark of Warding Dwarf. This is technically an Eberron-specific sub-race. So this is something that would require DM approval to use this subspecies outside of Eberron. While the 2014 Dwarf and its subspecies are marked as legacy species in D&D Beyond, the Eberron-specific subspecies are not marked as legacy yet. However, they did release an Unearthed Arcana for Eberron like a couple months ago. And in that we saw that instead of being tied to specific subspecies, that the Mark of Warding would then be sort of like an origin feat instead. So when they do inevitably release, you know, their extension to Eberron, the Armor of Agathys spell will be available through the Mark of Warding origin feat. At least that's how it showed in the Unearthed Arcana. But you would still need the sort of DM approval if you are trying to use that outside of Eberron. You know, some tables are definitely more lenient than others. So when that comes, definitely ask your DM if that's something that you can use. The last way to do it would be to play a Levistus Tiefling. These ones are subspecies of Tieflings that were in Monsters of the Multiverse, I believe. These ones are marked as legacy species in D&D Beyond, and that's mainly because the 2024 Tiefling has sort of subspecies options that are more general subspecies. There's a 9 Hells variant, there's an Abyss variant, and then there's the, I can't remember what the neutral plane is called. But instead of having like a tiefling subspecies for every archdevil, they have it by instead like each of the 3 lower planes of existence. If you were able to choose this option, I do think this is the weakest option. You probably shouldn't do it. But the Armor of Agathys is locked behind being level 5 first in that species, but you do get it as a second level spell, and it is only once per long rest. So definitely the weakest option. Probably wouldn't suggest that one unless you really wanted to play a tiefling and do this. So with that aside, let's get into the actual kind of classes and subclasses that can use this pretty well. We're going to start with the most probably well-known one, because this worked just as well in 2014 as it does in 2024, and that is going to be the Abjuration Wizard, or the Abjurer as it's called in 2024. We talked about the Abjurer a little bit in my last video regarding the Sage Advice, but the Abjurer has the Arcane Ward. This gives you a damage buffer equal to 2 times your wizard level plus your intelligence modifier, so this scales as you level up in wizard. And it is a buffer in the sense that it will take damage before your temporary hit points take damage. However, that attack that is damaging you is still considered to have hit you, so damage that is dealt to the Arcane Ward will still trigger the Armor of Agathys damage as well. There are some changes to the Arcane Ward in 2024, one of which is that it now benefits from your resistances as well as vulnerabilities, but of course, you know, resistances are much more common. So if you have like resistance to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing somehow, or whatever melee damage type that you're taking, that of course will help your Arcane Ward last longer. That will help your temporary hit points last longer. And then of course, when your Arcane Ward is reduced to 0, that doesn't mean that Armor of Agathys ends. Armor of Agathys only ends either after 1 hour or when your temporary hit points are reduced to 0, whichever comes first. The other change in 2024 is that you now actually need to spend spell slots on abjuration spells to refill the Arcane Ward throughout the day. The Arcane Ward regains a number of hit points equal to 2 times the level of the spell. Previously in 2014, they just required you to cast an abjuration spell, so you could like ritually cast or get free casts and buff it that way. Not anymore, although you now can also use a bonus action to just expend a spell slot and then give the Arcane Ward, you know, hit points equal to 2 times that spell slot's level. So while it is a little bit weaker in that way, it still really just works with this whole plan because Armor of Agathys is an abjuration spell. If our Arcane Ward is missing any hit points and we cast Armor of Agathys, it'll gain at least 2 more hit points. Not only that, but of course many of the wizard's best defense spells are also abjuration, things like shield, absorb elements, you know, counterspell, dispel magic, banishment is another one. You know, all these different spells that you might be casting anyway are just going to help that gameplay. And there's also the new spell in 2024 called Arcane Vigor. This is a bonus action to essentially self-heal yourself using your hit dice. That's also an abjuration spell, so that not only helps restore your own hit points, but it helps restore your Arcane Ward, which then of course also helps protect the Armor of Agathys. And then finally, the Abjurer also gets resistance to all spell damage at level 14. This is only damage against spells, not other magical effects. But if you're on like a wizard v wizard combat or wizard versus any other spellcaster, you know, that'll come in handy for you for sure to, again, make those effects last longer. So while the Abjuration Wizard is a very defensive wizard, you probably still, of course, don't want to be playing in the front lines. You're probably going to be looking to cast Armor of Agathys in a place where you're maybe in close quarters, like it's a very small room that you're in with a bunch of enemies, or you're just cornered in a spot, and then you can put up the Armor of Agathys and all your shields that way. But still, just a very cool combination for just a very cool subclass. The next one we're going to look at is the Twilight Cleric. So the Twilight Cleric, it hasn't been updated quite yet to 2024, so you would need to adjust when they get their subclass to level 3 if you're following the 2024 rules. Their Channel Divinity Twilight Sanctuary lets you grant yourself 1d6 plus your cleric level and temporary hit points at the end of your turn while it's active, and it is active for 1 minute. While the Twilight Sanctuary itself only lasts 1 minute, the temporary hit points don't last 1 minute. They will stay on you until the end of your next short rest, as is the rules for temporary hit points. In 2024, you get 1 use of your Channel Divinity back after every short rest, so hopefully you'll have this available to you whenever you need it. This isn't a lot of temporary hit points at once. I mean, it is quite a bit, 1d6 plus your cleric level. That's, a maximum of 26 at level 20, right? But also at those levels, creatures are going to be hitting you pretty hard. You're probably looking for this to help prevent damage from smaller attack. Definitely once you're at level like 10 or higher, creatures can be hitting pretty hard. So if you're not also reducing this damage with resistance or some other form of damage reduction, you probably don't want to take more than 1 hit per turn, and definitely not a hit from a very powerful creature, maybe just smaller creatures if you're trying to make the most out of something like Armor of Agathys. So definitely very much maybe early game, the Twilight Cleric can do quite a bit. As you level up, as far as that feature is extending the life of your Armor of Agathys, that might run a bit more of a risk where a creature just hits you so hard that it drops all of your temporary hit points, and then Armor of Agathys just stops. Moving on to the next subclass, which might be one of the better ones now in 2024 as well, is going to be the Moon Druid. So the one drawback here is that Wild Shape is a bonus action for all druids in 2024, which then conflicts with the casting of Armor of Agathys. Of course, Armor of Agathys does have a duration of 1 hour, so you could cast that before you go into Wild Shape. You could cast that before you're going into combat to get that going. Wild Shape now grants you temporary hit points equal to to 5 times your druid level for moon druids, so that's pretty significant. That's definitely going to be faster and better scaling than the Armor of Agathys spell itself. Again, much like the Twilight Cleric, the temporary hit points don't have a more specific duration, so if you cancel your wild shape by taking a bonus action to get out of it, you don't lose the temporary hit points for that. I don't know if that's intentional because they fixed a lot of the shape change spells like Polymorph and Shape Change and True Polymorph to not work like that, whereas they did that before, but it is possible that they want the druid itself to be unique in that way. It's also worth noting that wild shapes have just a generally better AC than the base creature, especially in 2024 when where your wild shape AC for moon druids is 13 plus your wisdom modifier. The wild shapes for moon druid are typically going to be more melee focused. You're more likely to trigger the additional damage from Armor of Agathys. You're more likely to be getting hit by melee attacks, and not only that, but many of the wild shapes make your size larger, sometimes even large, sometimes huge, sometimes some of them are even gargantuan. So not only are you sort of in the fray as a sort of melee beast, you can also just generally take up more space to make yourself a more sort of juicier target for the enemies. And that way you get sort of more procs off of the Armor of Agathys. And then you also have forms like the Giant's Octopus and the Giant Constrictor Snake. These have different grapples as well that can keep enemies near you. And then because they're grappled as well, they have disadvantage on attacking creatures other than you. So they're very much incentivized to attack you. And if they attack you with a melee attack, then they're going to take the reflected damage of Armor of Agathys for as long as you have those temporary hit points. Similar to Channel Divinity, wild shapes come back once per short rest in 2024, so you should probably hopefully always have one available to you if you're trying to pull off this combo. And pre-casting an Armor of Agathys can actually be pretty beneficial because of course while you're in wild shape you can't cast other spells anyway. The moon druid themselves can cast the spells that are on the Circle of the Moon druid spell list, things like Moonbeam, Starry Wisp, Conjure Animals I believe is on there as well. So there might be some other spells that you want to cast, but Armor of Agathys doesn't require concentration, so you can do both, but you may not be incentivized to upcast Armor of Agathys unless you're really thinking that you're going to be taking a lot of different attacks and you want to reflect a lot more damage. And it's also worth noting that because you don't lose the temporary hit points from wild shape when you get out of wild shape, is that let's say that you had a big Armor of Agathys on you, you went into wild shape to get a bunch more temporary hit points, and then let's say that those temporary hit points are getting low, you can on your turn bonus action shapeshift out and then do something like cast Polymorph on yourself to then give yourself a bunch more temporary hit points and then get a lot more out of that. So I think as far as just like getting the most out of a single casting of Armor of Agathys, it's probably got to go to the moon druid just in terms of how many temporary hit points they can give themselves like within a single combat. But just behind the Circle of the Moon druid there's also the Circle of the Spores druid. Very similar situation here. They have the symbiotic entity feature. This is the one that gives them like the circle of spores around them, allows them to do a couple different things, but part of it is that it also grants you temporary hit points equal to 4 times your druid levels. However, while this effect is ongoing, you can still do other things that a moon druid can't, like cast all your other druid spells. The symbiotic entity effect itself only lasts 10 minutes, but you still maintain the temporary hit points after the fact. The only things you lose after the 10 minutes are the 2 bullet points where it's like you deal an extra bit of damage on a melee attack, or there's some other effect too, but you maintain the temporary hit points until the end of your next short rest or until they go away. The next class we're going to look at here is maybe just one of the weaker examples. This is going to be the Clockwork Sorcerer. In 2014, the Clockwork Sorcerer might have been a pretty good example because they could get Armor of Agathys by switching out one of their subclass spell list spells. They can't do that anymore in 2024, which is a little unfortunate, but they do have a feature called Bastion of Law at level 6, I believe. This allows you to, once per long rest, spend a number of sorcery points to give yourself a pool of d8s, 1 per sorcery point that you pay into it. And then when you take damage, you can roll 1 or more of those d8s and then reduce the damage by that much. This is different from the Arcane Ward of the Abjuration Wizard, as the sorcerer is still taking damage at all times using this feature, so resistances and immunities of course will still apply here. If you spend 5 sorcery points into it, on average you're going to reduce up to 22.5 damage from a single attack, or an average of 4.5 per sorcery point. Again, you can only use this once per long rest, so this will probably be a situation where this is a class that'll want to cast a bigger Armor of Agathys, and if you have to multi-class into Warlock to get to it, that means your highest level spell slot every other level is going to be empty. And by empty I mean that you're not going to have a spell at that level to cast yet, which means that you can use it to upcast a lower level spell to a much higher power. That could be Armor of Agathys. So because we can sort of reduce damage this way, we maybe want to upcast a big Armor of Agathys and then use the Bastion of Law to reduce the damage to make those temporary hit points last longer. The Sorcerer also has a couple meta magic options that might be relevant. First is the Transmute spell. This of course can change the damage type of Armor of Agathys when necessary, such as if you're fighting a creature who is immune to cold damage. And there's also the Extended spell, which can make the duration of Armor of Agathys up to 2 hours. However, you should also be sure that you can make the Armor of Agathys spell spell lasts that long because, again, once you run out of temporary hit points, the spell ends early. And then the last class example here is probably going to be the Warlock, although, again, it's a little weird because it feels like the Warlock maybe gets the least out of Armor of Agathys, which is, again, weird because it's their spell. The one advantage that Warlocks have is that their pact slots are always the highest level that they are. So whenever you cast Armor of Agathys using a pact slot, it's always going to be cast at that highest level. It's always going to have these bonus temporary hit points. It's always going to be this much extra damage. And then if you do have other ways to get more temporary hit points on top of that, then you can help make it last a little bit longer. So you don't really have many more options to gain temporary hit points. There are things like the Darkwind's Blessing from the Fiend Warlock that grants temporary hit point bonuses, but this isn't always reliable. This is the one that relies on you either dropping an enemy to 0 or an ally in 2024, an ally dropping an enemy that's within 10 feet of you to 0. Not super reliable that you'll be able to re-up that to keep your Armor of Agathys going every round, or when you need it to happen at least. There is maybe a small call out for the Tomb of Levistus invocation. This can provide a big burst of temporary hit points. However, those temporary hit points go away at the end of your next turn. Tomb of Levistus is an invocation that basically encases you in a block of ice, and that block of ice is represented by just, again, a bunch of temporary hit points that scale with your Warlock level. But because the temporary hit points go away at the end of your next turn, that means that Armor of Agathys will also end at the end of your next turn because you'll have no more temporary hit points. So basically the only time you should try to be pulling off this sort of combination is if you know you can get a lot out of it. It does come back on a short rest, and much like your packed magic slots do, so there is maybe a situation where if you find yourself, if you have both Armor of Agathys and the Tomb of Levistus spell, and you're in a combat where there's just like a bunch of melee enemies in a small area, you could cast a big Armor of Agathys on yourself, go run right into the middle of them and try to get all their attention, hopefully. Obviously, there's no taunt effects in D&D, but if you're the closest target, hopefully they're going to attack you. So you cast Armor of Agathys, you go run in the middle of them, and then as they take their turns and hopefully they're attacking you, they're going to be taking that reflective damage from Armor of Agathys as those temporary hit points go down. And then when you would take the damage that would reduce those temporary hit points to 0, you then take your reaction to use Tomb of Levistus to give you a bunch more temporary hit points. And then you're also incapacitated while that happens, so maybe, hopefully, the enemies will keep attacking you while you're in there, and then that'll keep reflecting the damage. But then again, at the end of your next turn, those hit points go away, and the Armor of Agathys is over. But you probably dealt a ton of damage, so that's a very, 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 very situational example, but that is, a very cool moment that could be created with these sort of rules. Those are all the classes I wanted to point out, but I do want to talk about some other shapeshift effects, of course. The spell Polymorph grants the affected creature temporary hit points equal to the hit points of the creature. So when you get Polymorph, which is a 4th level spell at level 7 or 8, you can already transform yourself or an ally into the highest CR creatures available. The highest one is a Great Ape at CR 7 or 8. I can't remember which one it is, but it has 168 hit points, which would be 168 temporary hit points for you. I think there's a CR 7 one that is, within the same range. It's like within 20 hit points as well. It's like 140 something hit points, I think. Animal Shapes is an 8th level spell. It's sort of like a mass polymorph, but just for you and your allies. And it lasts for 24 hours, and you can keep shapeshifting them, but you only get the temporary hit points the first time that you cast the spell and shapeshift them. And you're also limited to beasts of CR 4 or less, and I believe the highest hit points I found in this is 90. So really not the best bang for your buck as far as hit points per spell level. Definitely not going to be using this to cast on one creature to extend the Armor of Agathys. That'll just be more happenstance if that happens. And then finally, at 9th level spells, you have things like Shape Change and True Polymorph. This allows you to turn into creatures that are a CR equal to your own level. Shape Change can't be constructs or undead, if I recall correctly, but then True Polymorph is True Polymorph. So those are potentially some big swings in your hit points as well. Again, I would probably never be casting these spells, or definitely not the higher level spells, in order to extend the duration of Armor of Agathys. But if you're in that situation already and you're going to be casting that spell already, that is just something that you could layer on top of it. So moving on to my final thoughts here. Again, I don't think Armor of Agathys itself is worth building around, but if you are in a class or subclass that can gain a lot of temporary hit points, it's not a bad tool to have. I do feel like this change helps non-warlocks more than it helps actual warlocks, because these classes are better at gaining, more temporary hit points or effective hit points in like the Arcane Ward for the Abjuration Wizard, for example, or the Druid in their wild shapes, whereas the warlock doesn't really have any of those options. It's really just relying on the massive temporary hit points from having an upcasted Armor of Agathys in the first place. At least in terms of, again, being more self-sufficient without external help, this is definitely a better change for other classes. Spells like False Light, even without the Fiendish Vigor invocation, and Fiendish Vigor is the one for warlocks that you you get it at will, and then when you cast it that way, you also get the max number of temporary hit points, which would be 12. I wouldn't say that these are probably worth it for trying to make the most out of Armor of Agathys. I mean, you can re-up them like once you're out of combat, but casting False Life takes your whole action. All it does is sort of give you a middling amount of temporary hit points, and it's just going to use more additional spell slots unless you're using the Fiendish Vigor Invocation. So really just not the best use of our resources. Instead, we want to be looking at spells that, again, grant a bunch of temporary hit points and do something else like our polymorphs. And sort of on that note, again, teamwork is going to make the dream work. You know, while being self-sufficient like a Moon Druid can be with their wild shapes and being able to cast polymorph on themselves to really get the most burst out of it in a single combat, more often than not, this might be something that comes up just in a game where one person just has Armor of Agathys, another person has polymorph or other different spells that grant temporary hit points. You have a Twilight Cleric as well to just kind of dump those temporary hit points on that player who's using Armor of Agathys to really, again, milk the most out of that extra damage. Now that we can sort of prevent Armor of Agathys from ending early. So I do think that Armor of Agathys and then into polymorph is sort of the biggest bang for our buck without expending a 9th level spell to cast true polymorph on ourselves. But is it the best case scenario, or is there one more possible magical Christmas land situation that we could come up with where we could get the most temporary hit points possible? And of course there is. There's the weapon Black Razor, which if you're able to get Black Razor on a character that also has Armor of Agathys, which is, I think this is the weapon that was named originally in the Hexblade subclass. So there's a feature of Black Razor called Devour Soul. It still works this way in 2024. When you use Black Razor to reduce a creature to 0 hit points, the sword slays that creature and devours its soul. When Black Razor devours a soul that isn't yours, you gain temporary hit points equal to that slain creature's hit point maximum. So this does assume that you land the killing blow with the Black Razor. It doesn't work on constructs or undead, but this does give us a theoretical maximum of killing a Tarask who rolled maximum hit points, which is 1020 hit points. So if we land the killing blow on that Tarask with the Black Razor, we get 1020 temporary hit points, and then we can cast a big Armor of Agathys on ourselves and then just let people attack us. Obviously, you know, the Tarask is the super duper best case scenario, but even if you just have a Black Razor, then just in a combat with a bunch of minions, you can maybe kill in a couple of attacks and maybe have like 30 to 40 hit points. That is just refreshing those temporary hit points, you know, hopefully at least once per round as you do that. So that is everything I wanted to cover in this video. I hope you like kind of all the ideas that I kind of threw around. I didn't have time to really get into the nitty-gritty math of how things scale, but again, I do think that the Abjuration Wizard is still a very good choice for it. The Moon Druid or even the Spores Druid are both pretty good options in their own way. Again, I don't think it's worth building around, but I think if you want to have Armor of Agathys as a tool that's sort of in your back pocket, it is definitely something worth considering if that's something you're trying to do and you're already going into one of those subclasses. If there's any sort of other ideas or anything that you could think of while you're watching this video, please let me know down in those comments down below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you're a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.